This next session will be about ritual language, poetry, symbols. In Eastern Indonesia, we'll follow from Eastern Indonesia to the world and beyond. I mean, we're going as far as we can with that. All right? So let me begin. Ritual language, which is my phrase for what the Rottennese do, is what Jacobson would call canonical parallelism. It requires the pairing of in words with each other. There always has to be another pair, so that in a performance, the lines, there can be consecutive lines, or it can be in a different form, but basically it's most often comparative, on a comparative, most often it is consecutive lines. And all the words in Rottennese and in other systems of canonical parallelism, this rigorous, culturally required pairing is a requirement of performance. In Rotti, this is, and I use another term for it, it is semantic parallelism, because for every word in the whole of the Rottennese repertoire, there is at least one complement. So I have prepared a very large dictionary of what I call dyadic sets. These are the required paired words that you need in the preparation of it. From what we can interpret, and of course it's always interpretation, this is a pattern that is already common throughout the Middle East. It begins in Sumeria and carries on to Akkadian, goes on into Canaanite, very strong in Canaanite, and it appears in the Hebrew Bible. And as such, that is where the first focus was. So you have this figure, 18th century figure, Bishop Loth, who is the first to call attention to this as a linguistic phenomena. And he calls it parallelism, whereby one line, he's talking more in lines. He says one line corresponds to another line, and that is meticulously maintained. This kind of phenomena is by no means confined to Middle Eastern traditions. The Mayan tradition, as the Aztec tradition, and also the Inca tradition, all have similar requirements of canonical parallelism, where you must pair words. And in the Mayan tradition, it's paired words, and they're doublets and they're triplets. Most of Southeast Asia, not all of Southeast Asia, has it. Austronesian languages, an amazing number of Austronesian languages have it, but not all languages. So it is a phenomena, it's a world phenomena. If you look at something like, well, the Mongolian tradition or the Ural-Finnic tradition, there is a very strong parallelism, a canonical parallelism. So this is what Jakobson would call a near universal. It's not a universal. So it needs some consideration, but it is, I think, a fundamental question. And this is the topic which Jakobson, as I have said, Jakobson called the double door for anthropology and linguistics. It isn't simply an anthropological question, it's a linguistic question. And there are many aspects to it. And I would say that my research since the early 70s and my encounter with Roman Jakobson has, one aspect of my research has been the exploration of this kinds of parallelism. The first book, the first collected set of essays I put together was something called To Speak in Pairs. And that was a collection of essays by anthropologists from Timor, from Roti, myself, from Sumba, number of really good systems in Sumba, from Sulawesi, and from Flores, all looking at this phenomena, I would say, as it is performed in Eastern Indonesia. So the first step was to call attention to Eastern Indonesia as one of the areas, certainly not the only Austronesian area, but one of the areas where there is this canonical parallelism. As a performance genre, it varies. For example, the Tetun people have a form of canonical parallelism, but in every one line, there is only one pair. There is only one pair per line. And so you have, I would have to say, from a Rotanese point of view, I'm speaking as a Rotanese, pretty boring. Because when in a Rotanese poetic line can have 3, often 4, sometimes 5 separate semantic pairs within two couplet lines. So Rotanese as a system of canonical parallelism is far more complex. And you can look at the different degrees of complexity in parallelism. You can also look at the number of ways in which parallelism is used, because oftentimes parallelism works best, certainly in Hebrew and Canaanite, it works best when you have these reverses. And you have a whole range of things. You can have step parallelism, where you can have 3 lines and then 3 matching lines. The performance, there is a vast area of investigation, and some of that is what I've been doing. Now, one of the things I did, and as I explained, Roti is a dialect chain. And therefore, as a dialect chain, contiguous areas can understand each other, but further removed becomes harder. One of the functions of Rotanese ritual language is its ability to overcome all of the dialect differences, and how that is done is very interesting, because in many pairs, you will have the dyadic set, the two complements, the two pairs, are made up of a word from two of the different dialects. So you'll have a word from the Eastern dialect and one from the Western dialect that say the same thing. So fuheni, full. One is from the East, one is from the West, or something like that. With the fact that when it is recited across the island, someone will recognize, or will most often recognize, the pair in their dialect and then match it with the pair that they may be less known to them from another dialect. So by choosing materials from across the dialect chain, this is a communicative device that transcends change in particular areas. You can generalize even further, and you can show that this continuum works between related languages, between Rotanese, the Toni, and Tetu. They are part of what was once a long chain of words where you can see where the complements fit. I've sort of document that just and illustrate it. But it's very interesting that very often canonical parallelism will appear in areas of linguistic diversity. In fact, in some ways, to get canonical parallelism at its best, you almost need linguistic diversity to build on. So it's another comparative generalization that I've advanced. In a book which I wrote and published with the ANU Press as an e-publication, I wrote a book, or a book is a compilation a compilation of my previous papers and extended, and it's called Explorations in Semantic Parallelism. And I go from my paper on Jakobson, then I read another paper updating Jakobson, then go on to look at the papers I wrote in the 70s and 80s, and go on from there to look at more and more of these the papers on that use parallelism. One of those papers, and this is, I think, rather interesting from a Rotanese point of view, is that parallelism, which was originally used in ritual settings for origin narratives, for all sorts of traditional devices, has now, with the Rotanese conversion to Christianity, been used to tell biblical stories. And I think you're familiar with Adam and Eve on the island of Roti. That was a text. Originally recited for me as to explain the origin of death. And though it's about Adam and Eve and the forbidden fruit, it's about the snake, which is an eel, snake eel, which has all of those elements. It's also intended to explain the expulsion from the Garden of Eden and the origin of death. So it has been given a traditional purpose within Rotanese understandings. So that, I thought, when I first encountered it, was very unusual, exceptional, and I published on it. And I've included that as one of my papers in this exploration in semantic parallelism. However, at the end, when I came to retirement, again, I was very fortunate because I put in for a large, or what I thought was a large grant, to be able to study ritual language across all of the dialects of Roti. That's what I set out. It was to study all of the different dialects. At that time, I didn't fully understand the dialect chain. All I knew is there was this great linguistic difference. And I myself had great difficulty in understanding, especially certain dialects in the east of Roti. Because, among other things, where Roti has L, they have R, and they're you could almost call them L and R dialects. I know an L dialect, and I find R dialects very difficult. But there's much more than that at work. So I set out a project, and this time, what happened on all my field work was that I recorded ritual compositions only when they made themselves available or when someone came to tell me. Every one of my recordings was, in that sense, opportunistic. I wasn't able to work systematically because I had to take what I could record. So I proposed in this project to bring poets from across the island. And I'd bring them to Bali. We would set up, and I had a hotel, it's not a fancy hotel, but a very simple family hotel on the Sanur beach in Bali. And I would bring half a dozen, and it was up to about sometimes as many as 9 poets from different dialect areas. And we'd spend an entire week recording. And these poets, I would say, many of whom had never met each other because they came from different domains, would have a chance to hear other dialect performances and actually, and as it turned out, learn from each other. And so I journeyed to Roti to recruit my first group of poets. And one of the poets I recruited everyone had told me he was the master of masters at the time from East Roti, from a domain called Ringo. And he agreed to come. And having recruited him the first time, he became my recruiter. For every subsequent session, and we held 11 sessions altogether, he would travel around Roti and identify who were the best poets. And he would invite them in my name to come and join us. So we would change poets. We would also invite poets who were really good to come back again. Poets who were less than good, we didn't invite back. But there was always a mix of poets. And sometimes there were 7, sometimes there were up to 9. And at one point, we invited poets from neighboring islands. And for a while, the project was working with poets in parallelism, working for poets in Tetun. So it was a big project. And out of that project, one of the first publications was a book which I published again only a few years ago called Master Poets, Ritual Masters. And again, that is free for download from the ANU Press. And what it is my first serious attempt to look at variation across the island. And what it consists of is one composition known across the whole of the island called Suti Solo do Binabane, and it was one that I had been gathering in Termana, so I already had various versions of Suti Solo, including one from Old Meno and one from another very old poet. I had it from several poets gathered in 65 and 72. So I had a small collection. And then I got all of these other poets where there was almost a qualification. If you came on the project to Bali, you'd be asked, if you knew it, would you recite Suti Solo de Binabani, that composition? So the book, Master Poets, Ritual Masters, is a study of a single composition, this Suti Solo Binabani, which is a long recitation about the expulsion of the nautilus shell and a baler shell to land, its adventures on land, always asking for companionship, asking for who will I speak to, who will I, who will I speak with, who will I talk with, was one of the refrains in all of these poems, one way or other. But anyway, it's 21 versions of the same, but 21 versions gives you a glimpse of how variation occurs in ritual compositions, and yet how you can understand it across all of the domains. So for me, Master Poet, Ritual Master was one of the most important comparative studies I've done, but it's comparative entirely within Roti. Then, thanks to a colleague by the name of Frog, a colleague in Helsinki, we've begun looking at parallelism worldwide. And he had a symposium in 2014 looking at parallelism, not just in the Ural tribe, the Finnish tradition, but we looked at other traditions around the world. It was a very interesting, and I think as it was a return to the study of parallelism as a world phenomena. And then from that, we gathered a whole group of people from southern, writing on the Thai populations of southern China, Roti, from the Maya traditions, from a whole range of people, and we did an entire volume in the journal Oral Traditions. And since I've written some more on the formulaic, this is another aspect of whereas there is pairing in all of these compositions, there is also a strong element of formulaic, but that formulaic consists of you could say strings of pairs, and that formulaic also operates within almost all these oral traditions, and certainly very strong in Rotanese. Then, in the course of this, what I call the Master Poets project on Bali, I made a further discovery. And that is that in the far east of Roti, parallelism, the kinds of traditions that I was gathering have now receded. The ones I was gathering in central Roti or East Roti or southern Roti had receded. And what was taking its place was entirely Christian parallelism. We had a poet. I was astonished at him. He was a lay preacher. Many poets are lay preachers in the Christian church. And he was a lay preacher. And you give him, and I did, opened his Bible, pointed to a passage, and said, all right, give this back to me in parallelism. And he could, without thought, render a passage that wasn't in parallelism into beautiful parallelism. And I have to say, I watched one of the poets from South Roti who had never seen that. He was a traditionalist to his toes, and he saw how this person did it. And immediately, not immediately, he pondered it. And then I gave him a challenge, and I said, "All right, you try it." And he had to go away. He couldn't do it spontaneously this way this poet from Lando did, but he went away, thought about it, and then, for example, I gave him the Judgment of Solomon. And I said, "You render this into parallels," and he did a beautiful job. And so I'm also I'm spreading these traditions, which were unheard of in some parts of Roti. They're spreading to other parts of Roti. Anyway, this parallelism, this Christian parallelism, I've gone back again to the Dutch archives and a lot of unpublished things to say, where did it begin? And I think I've pinpointed it. At the turn of the century, when Roti was technically declared a Christian society for 200 some years, a Dutch missionary declared that he said the opposite. After 200 years, it's amazing how little Christianity is here. His impression was that they weren't Christian, or if in his phrase, some of them were able to put on their Sunday clothes and wear their Sunday clothes to church, and that was about as far as Christianity had gone. And you could see this man switching. He said, he's saying, you cannot spread Christianity using Malay. You have to use ritual language. And he recruited a whole group of Rotanese preachers, initially preachers, and in fact, he formed a whole school on Roti, which all of whom became noted preachers in ritual language. So I have documented in the book that's in Explorations in Semantic Parallels, and I touch on it in my book that's about to be published maybe next week. The next book, I go into a great deal to provide the historical background. But this idea of a Christian parallelism, which means, and just think about it, which means is there are so many concepts, Christian concepts, for which there is no Rotanese term. So if you look at the vocabulary that's created, it's a created vocabulary, but there are conventions established using, for words like redemption or for words, all sorts of biblical words, absolutely foreign to Rotanese, are now imported in a special semantic vocabulary, which is Christian and which can be used for Christian. There's also this middle ground. And some of the preachers, I recorded a preacher, one of the old preachers, I recorded him in 1966. I was so taken with his presentation that I thought it was a traditional. For a long time, I thought I had recorded a traditional composition. But as I began to understand the conventions of Christian parallelism, I realized that he had retaken so many of the traditional terms and was using them as in a Christian thing. So his story of a waringan, and you follow the path of life on the branches of a waringan tree and whatnot, is in fact a Christian homily, not a traditional composition. So there are these things, and in the book that is coming out now, I publish two long the book is a collection of origin narratives in parallelism, and the final part of the book is all about these Christian genesis, one of which approximates the telling of the Christian genesis, and the other is so wildly aberrant, but it's a genesis. You can see it. The core was Genesis, and it's been made so entirely Rotanese that it's absolutely fascinating. But again, you're looking at this ability to take a tradition and remodel it and use it as, and now probably, well, no, I would say in some parts of Roti, the Christian versions of parallelism outnumber the traditional versions. Okay. So much so for Roti and different aspects of parallelism, but there's more. And this, I would just say this, and this is what I take up in the last chapter of my explorations, where I look at where I am going now. And my argument is that this parallel, this dyadic structure that you see is not an artifact. Well, it is an artifact of performance. Performance is in pairs, but in fact, to understand the semantics underlying this, you have to look at networks. And I have used, using my dyadic dictionary and working from thousands of pairs, I'm able to create these semantic networks. And so there is a further underlying phenomena, and parallelism from this underlying phenomena looks different from the way it looks just simply from performance. So that's what I would present.